Okay, I hope I'm audible to all my students who are attending this particular lecture for the intermediate microeconomics part 2 course. In this particular lecture, I'm going to continue with the discussion of the three equation model, which is the ISPCMR model. Okay, if all students recall that in the previous lecture, I had just introduced this particular module to all students, and we had learned that in the current scenario, how does the central bank design its monetary policy? We learned that the central bank is more of forward looking, so it makes forecasts about inflation. Okay, whatever policies are adopted by the central bank are based on forecasts of macroeconomic variables like output and inflation. Then we had also learned in the previous lecture what are the questions a central bank is going to face when it's designing its monetary policy, and how the central bank kind of answers these questions before it designed its monetary policy. Okay, now in this particular lecture, I'm going to discuss with all students a real life example, a scenario where we are going to see how the IS curve, how the Phillips curve, and how the monetary policy rule together are used in order to respond to that particular shock. Okay, so let's quickly start with the discussion of this particular lecture. This is a very important lecture. We look at what happens when a shock hits the economy. It can be a positive or a negative shock. I'm going to look at a positive shock. What happens if there's a consumption boom in the economy? Suppose consumption drastically goes up in the economy. Now, how the central banks are going to use their monetary policy rule combined with the IS curve and the Phillips curve to respond to this particular shock. Okay, remember the objective of the central bank is to eventually bring the economy back to the full potential level of output and the target rate of inflation. Okay, and for the UK economy, I think I had discussed in the previous lecture that approximately the target rate of inflation is around 2%. Okay, so let's quickly start with the discussion of this lecture. Okay, we look at the impact of a consumption boom on the IS, PC, and MR model. So I'm just writing the main heading for completeness. First of all, we are looking at the ISPCMR model. The ISPCMR model, also called the three equation model. The three equation model. And I'm also writing the name of the book I'm following for reference. This is Macroeconomics by Wendy Carlin. Macroeconomics by Wendy Carlin and David Toskis. Okay, this is one of the standard books we follow at the intermediate level macroeconomics course. Okay, now let's look at the impact of a consumption. So consider the impact of a consumption boom on the ISPCMR model. Now, let me quickly start with the diagram. I'm going to draw three diagrams. One is going to depict the IS curve, another is going to depict the weight setting, price setting equations, and one last diagram is going to depict the Phillips curve and the monetary policy rule. Remember, in the previous lecture, we learned that Phillips curve and the monetary rule curve are drawn in the same space, output inflation space. Okay, so let's quickly draw the diagram. So what I'm doing is, students, I'm first of all erasing everything off because I will be needing some space to draw the diagram. Okay, so we are looking at the impact of a consumption boom. So on the top, I'm drawing these diagrams. There are three diagrams I'm drawing. Okay, so we have the first diagram, we have output on the horizontal axis. We have interest rates on the vertical axis. interest rate. Okay, so I can maybe write it here, interest rate. And then the second diagram, we have employment on the horizontal axis. We have real wages on the vertical axis. And the last diagram, we have output on the horizontal axis, and we have inflation. I can use pi to denote inflation. Okay. Similarly, on the top, I can just use the interest rate I. Instead of writing interest rate, I can just write I to save on some space. Okay, so the first diagram is my IS curve. The IS curve, we all have done this in the Keynesian economy modules before as well. The IS curve shows combinations of output and interest rates such that the goods market is in equilibrium. It is downward sloping. Lower interest rates cause investment to rise. Investment rises, output rises. So the relationship between interest rates and output is negative. We all know that. Okay. So suppose initially we are at point A, and this is my interest rate at point A. Interest rate at point A. Okay, and corresponding to it, this is my equilibrium level of output. So I can say this is my equilibrium output. Let me write it as EQM. EQM means equilibrium output. Then we have the weight setting and the price setting curve in the second diagram. The weight setting curve is upward sloping when you are measuring employment on the horizontal axis. If instead of employment, if I was measuring unemployment, then the weight setting curve would have been downwards. But recall from my modules on labor supply, Keynesian economy and labor supply curves, which we have covered in our intermediate macroeconomics course before, the weight setting curve is upward sloping. So this is my weight setting curve, WS. The price setting curve is horizontal. So this is my price setting curve. Okay. Again, weight setting and price setting curves are not new for all students because you must have done this before in the lectures on Keynesian economy and labor supply. Okay. So this is the weight setting curve and the price setting curve. And corresponding to it, I can just stretch the equilibrium output down. So this is again corresponding to the equilibrium output, I have equilibrium employment. EQM denotes equilibrium employment. Okay. And then the last diagram, we have the Phillips curve and we have the monetary policy, monetary rule. Okay. So first of all, let me draw the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is like this. In the inflation output space, it is upward sloping. This is my Phillips curve. And this Phillips curve is drawn corresponding to the fact that actual and target inflation both are equal to 2%. Remember, for the UK economy, we said that the expected inflation, the target rate of inflation is 2%. So this Phillips curve is drawn under the expectation of inflation equal to 2%. Okay, so I can draw it even at a lower level because we are going to show the Phillips curve shifts also. So to utilize space, let me draw it like this. This is Phillips curve with expected inflation equal to 2%. Remember that Phillips curve shifts when expected inflation changes. Okay, so I can say I can just bring this down. I can bring this down, and this is my equilibrium out. This is my equilibrium out, and corresponding to it, my inflation is 2%. This 2% is my target rate of inflation. Okay, now let us see what all is going to happen when there's a consumption boom. So whatever diagram students can see now is your initial situation. Initial interest rates in the economy, initial equilibrium output, you can see the weight setting and the price setting curves corresponding to the equilibrium output give you the equilibrium level of employment. And if I map it down to the last diagram, I see that this is my equilibrium output, and corresponding to it, the economy is at the target rate of inflation of 2%. That means the Phillips curve is telling you, this particular Phillips curve at the bottom is telling you that the actual and expected inflation both are equal to 2%. And let me call this as point A. Let me call this as point A. And here also this is corresponding to point A in the first diagram. Now, when a consumption boom happens, the first thing that is going to happen is that the IS curve is going to shift. We know that the consumption boom causes the IS curve to shift. Okay, output increases at the same interest rates. That means I can show a rightward shift of the IS curve from IS to IS dash. Okay, we move, so at the same interest rate IA, output goes up. So we reach somewhere here. This output is a high output level. And let me call this as point B. And you can clearly see that interest rates at point A and interest rates at point B are the same. So I can write here that IA is equal to IB. That means the interest rates at point A and the interest rates at point B are equal. The red point here, I can further stretch this down to the second diagram, and I can further stretch it down to the third diagram, because all these diagrams are like compared with each other. So this red thing denotes the red output level here, denotes the high output level. I can write high output. And here this is going to be high employment. High employment. Okay. And here also this is my high out level. So I can manage some space. The black one was equilibrium output and the red one is high output. Okay, now we have to see that when the central bank is going to face this shock of a consumption boom, what are the policies the central bank is going to adopt to come back to the equilibrium output level and the target rate of inflation. Okay, so let's quickly analyze this diagram. So I am now making all students write the explanation. Let's look at the explanation. So I can just erase this and I can utilize the space in a better way. Let's look at the explanation. So the consumption shock, the consumption boom, the consumption boom has its initial positive impact. It has its initial positive impact on output and employment. It has its initial positive impact on output and employment, as shown by a rightward shift. As shown by a rightward shift of the IS curve and movement from point A, movement from point A to B in the IS diagram. Whatever I'm writing, students can also see this happening in the diagram. You can clearly see that the consumption boom is going to have a positive impact on output and employment. See, equilibrium output has also gone up, equilibrium employment has also gone up. There's a rightward shift in the IS curve. We move from point A to point B in the IS diagram. Okay, so now let us see what is going to happen further. Now let us see what is going to be the impact of the shift in the IS curve on the second and the third diagram. So I can write by following the diagrams, from top to bottom, we can see we can see that the labor market impact, we can see that the labor market impact of the consumption boom, the labor market impact of the consumption boom is reflected in the disturbance, it is reflected in the disturbance of the initial constant inflation equilibrium. The initial constant inflation equilibrium. Till now, we were assuming that inflation is also constant at 2%. But now, the moment there is going to be a consumption boom, it is going to cause inflation also to rise. Because a consumption boom causes the output demanded to rise, which in turn is now going to cause inflation and wages to rise. So first of all, what will happen to the wage setting equation and the price setting equation? Okay, so first of all, you can clearly see that when there is high employment, in this, look at the second diagram. This is the red point corresponding to the high employment. Corresponding to it, now what are the wages the workers are going to demand? The moment workers come to know that in the economy output has gone up, they are going to demand higher wages, right? That means that instead of this black low wage, workers are going to demand this red high wage. Corresponding to a higher output level, you have high employment, and corresponding to high employment, workers are going to demand higher wage. Now let us see how much this gap is going to be. So I can continue forward with the explanation that at the first wage setting round, following an increase in employment, or students can also write a fall in unemployment, both are the same. Whether you write increase in employment or you write fall in unemployment, it's one and the same thing. At the first wage setting round, following an increase in employment, wages and prices will rise. Wages and price will rise from the target inflation rate of 2%. From the target inflation rate of 2%. What I'm trying to say is the first impact is going to happen in the labor market is that when there is going to be a consumption boom, prices will rise. So that means now we are going to deviate from the target inflation rate. Now the actual inflation will be above the target rate of 2%. 2% was my target rate, target inflation rate. Now actual inflation will go above the 2% target inflation rate. Okay, so you can clearly see that as illustrated in the wage setting and price setting diagram, I can just write WSPS. As illustrated in the wage setting and the price setting diagram, the shock has opened up a gap of 1% between the low real wage and the high real wage. The low real wage and the high real wage consistent with the tighter labor market, consistent with the tighter labor market, following the consumption boom. Following the consumption boom. So you can see that this gap is going to be 1%. Okay, why is it 1%? Because you can clearly see that uh, because of inflation of 2%, because workers expect inflation of 2%, first of all, they would expect that their wages should rise by 2%. Okay, and then how much will workers now demand? To compensate for expected inflation of 2%, they will demand 2% higher wages. And then they also want to cover the gap of this 1%, which is arising between the wage setting and the price setting equations. Okay. So I am once again making it clear to all students. I also want to make a addition here. This 1% increase is given to us. That means when the consumption boom happened, the consumption boom led output to rise. Okay, it led employment to rise. So obviously workers started demanding higher wages. That means we are given that the higher real wage is 1% more than the low real. Okay, so I am reading it once again as illustrated in the wage setting price setting diagram. The shock has opened up a gap of 1% between the low real wage and the high real wage. This is given to us. We are assuming that the high real wage goes up by 1% compared to the low real wage. And it makes sense also, because workers start demanding higher nominal wages, and higher nominal wages also lead to higher real wages if we are assuming inflation to be constant at 2%. I'm repeating it once again. If we assume that inflation is constant at 2%, workers will start demanding higher nominal wages because employment and output have gone up, and higher nominal wages would lead to higher real wages by exactly 1%. Now, the nominal wages of the workers will increase by how much? So if I erase, now I'm erasing the initial part of the explanation. I hope students have written down the initial part. Okay, so erasing this particular portion of, I'm continuing with the explanation on the top. Okay, so now I can write that this means that workers will get 2% wage rise to compensate them. They will get a 2% wage rise to compensate them for the erosion of their real wages. They will get a 2% wage rise to compensate them for the erosion of their real wages due to the last period's inflation. Due to the last period's inflation. Remember, last period also inflation was 2%. That means workers are going to demand 2% more wages to compensate them for their real wage being falling because of last year's inflation. Plus, I can write an additional 1% increase, an additional 1% increase to bring their real wages, up to the level indicated by, I can write this clearly, up to the level indicated by the wage setting curve. What I'm trying to say is listen to me very carefully, all students. What I'm trying to say is that uh, workers are going to demand 2% higher wages because of the last period's inflation of 2%. And they're also going to demand 1% more just to bring their real wage back to the new level, as indicated by the red wage setting curve, this curve. That means workers are going to demand their wages to rise by 3%. 2% to compensate for the last period's inflation, and 1% to bring them to the new real wage. So I can write this point. In this case, wages rise by 3%. And when I say wages, it means nominal wages. So I can be more precise so that students are not getting confused. In this case, nominal wages rise by 3%. Why do they rise by 3%? Because expected inflation is 2% and you need a 1% more increase just because of the consumption boom which happened. That means compared to the last year, this year inflation was expected to be 2%. That means I will expect my wages to go up by 2%. But because consumption boom also happened this year, I will demand 1% more because of this consumption boom. That means 2 plus 1, 3%. In the bracket, I can write 2% because of expected inflation and 1% because of the consumption boom, which makes it nominal wages go up by 3%. And now firms also have to maintain their profit margin. So if nominal wages go up by 3%, firms will increase prices also by 3%. So I can erase all this and I can write that point as. So I can write, in this case, nominal wages increase by 3% and firms automatically raise their prices. They automatically raise their prices by 3% to protect their profit margins. Firms have to maintain their profit margins, right? So if the wages go up by 3%, they increase prices also by 3%. That means the actual inflation rises to 3%. So I can say that, therefore, in other words, actual inflation rises to 3%. Actual inflation rises to 3%. That means what will happen to the Phillips curve? For the same output level, inflation, instead of being 2%, now becomes 3%. That means my Phillips curve is going to shift up. So it's going to shift to the red Phillips curve. So I can draw another Phillips curve like this. This red Phillips curve corresponds to people now expecting inflation to be 3%. The red Phillips curve corresponds to expected inflation of 3%. The black Phillips curve was the initial Phillips curve corresponding to expected inflation of 2%. So I can write this particular point that the increase in inflation, from 2% to 3% is shown by the movement. It is shown by the movement along the Phillips curve. First of all, there's going to be a movement along the Phillips curve. So let's say this is, if I stretch this up, 3% will be, it's going to be this point B. You're moving from point A to point B, and this is 3%. If I stretch it here, this is 3%. So first of all, there is a movement along the Phillips curve. because output has gone up. Workers expect their wages to now go up by 3%. They demand 3% higher nominal wages. Prices go up by 3%. That means inflation, instead of being 2%, now becomes 3%. So there's a movement along the Phillips curve from point A to point B. So this is shown by the movement along the Phillips curve from point A to B. Okay, now when inflation becomes 3%, workers were actually expecting inflation to be only 2. Now actual inflation becomes higher than what they were expecting. Workers will start increasing their expectations of inflation. So I can say here we need to take into account, we need to take into account the fact that higher inflation of 3%, higher inflation of 3% will be embedded in the expectation of the wage setters. In the expectation of the wage setters. What I'm trying to point out is that the moment workers will realize that, okay, they were expecting inflation to be 2%, but actual inflation is now 3%. Workers will start increasing their expectations of inflation because the actual inflation is now higher than the expected. Workers were expecting inflation to be 2%. Actual inflation is 3%. Workers will start increasing their expectations of inflation. Okay, so what will happen to the Phillips curve? Phillips curve will now shift to the red Phillips curve because workers will start expecting inflation to be 3%. When the actual inflation is 3%, workers will also start expecting inflation to be 3%. That means the Phillips curve will now shift up. So I can now erase the initial portion of, hoping students have made notes in the beginning. I can write that for the next wage setting round, when workers now plan to set the next set of wages, for the next wage setting round, the expected inflation of 3%, the expected inflation of 3% will mean that the relevant Phillips curve, facing the central bank, will shift upwards to the red Phillips curve in the last diagram. Look at the last diagram. Okay, in the next wage setting round, workers are going to demand 3% higher wages. Okay, and that will lead to inflation to rise from 2 to 3%. So wage setters will now also expect inflation, instead of being 2%, they will expect inflation to be 3%. That will cause the Phillips curve to shift up in the last diagram. Okay, so I can say, given this forecast, of inflationary behavior, the central bank chooses its best response to the situation. That is, that place that place on the new Phillips curve, that place on the new Phillips curve, the new Phillips curve is the red Phillips curve, that place on the new Phillips curve where it would like to locate, where it would like to locate. Okay, so let me explain this also to all students. Let me first of all erase the bottom paragraph. What I'm trying to say now is the central bank comes to know that, okay, the public is now expecting inflation to be 3%. That means the central bank knows what? The central bank knows that the new Phillips curve is no longer the black one, it's the red one. So now central bank has to choose that point on the new Phillips curve so that it's able to come back to the target equilibrium output and the target rate of inflation. Okay, now what point the central bank is going to choose on the red Phillips curve. Okay, so the central bank, you can clearly see that the objective is to come back to both 2% inflation and equilibrium output. That means in yellow color, these are the points the central bank wants to come back. We need to come back to this point, which is target inflation of 2%. We want to come back to this point. That means initially central bank is going to choose a point somewhere here where it is able to like move towards both target inflation as well as the equilibrium output. Okay, so I can make our students write this point that its preference, or I can write the central bank's preference, the central bank's preference is likely to be for a balanced response. The central bank can't be one-sided that let me achieve target inflation or let me only achieve equilibrium output. The central bank wants to achieve both. There's going to be a balanced response, that is making progress in getting inflation back, in getting the inflation back towards the target. In the bracket I can write which is 2%, but not imposing a harsh recession. But not imposing a harsh recession. Such as point C. Such as point C. This is point C. Okay, let me use yellow color only. This is point C. This is point C. Okay, now point C would mean that you are moving towards achieving a lower inflation, but then you have to face a harsh recession because this is way lower than your equilibrium output. Okay, you would not want to actually be at point C. What I'm trying to say is you would not want to be at point C. You would not want to be at point, let me correct myself. Actually, you would want to be at point C, but you would not want to be at a point, let's say C dash. Let me show C dash to our students. So if I stretch this forward, look at this green point. Students can look at this green point. This green point is C dash. Now at this green point, the central bank is able to achieve target inflation of 2% back, but that is coming at a very harsh recession. You are way lower as compared to the equilibrium output. So instead of C dash, the central bank would likely to be at point C. So I say that in the bracket I can write point C will be preferred over C dash by the central bank. At point C, maybe your inflation would be only, let's say, 2.5. So at point C, this would be 2.5, not exactly 2. So what I'm trying to say is the central bank will not adopt policies that are very extreme. If the central bank wants to come down from 3 to 2%, the central bank will have to face a very harsh recession, as given by the green point, which is way lower than the black point. This is the black point, right? The equilibrium out. Instead of going from the black to the green point, the central bank will go from black to yellow point. Because going from black to yellow is still not going too much in terms of reducing the output. But going from black to green is like tolerating a very high recession just to meet the target inflation rate of 2%. That means, given the new Phillips curve, the red Phillips curve, the central bank would want to choose the yellow point, this points. Okay, so this point C will lie on the MR. So I can now erase the initial portion of students. I understand that this is a slightly difficult lecture because you have to make notes as well and you have to understand as well. So maybe you can rewind and watch the lectures again. That's going to help you. So you can clearly see that point C will lie on the MR curve. It will lie on the MR or the monetary rule curve. The central bank is going to choose point C on the MR curve, okay, which helps this is the way the central bank best responds to the new Phillips curve. Okay, so I can write that point C will lie on the MR curve, which shows the central bank's optimal output inflation pair, which shows the central bank's optimal output inflation pair for any Phillips curve it faces. So what I'm trying to explain all students is that the MR curve is going to tell us how the central bank will best respond to the given Phillips curve in terms of choosing a pair of output and inflation. I repeat again, the MR curve, every point on the MR curve will tell you how the central bank best responds to the new Phillips curve by choosing a pair of output and inflation. So given the red Phillips curve in the last diagram, the central bank will choose point C, which is the combination of output and inflation, instead of choosing the green point where the output is way below the equivalent output, triggering a recession, bad recession. Okay, so I can now continue forward with the explanation, but you can clearly see at point C, inflation is still 2.5%. It's still higher than the targeted level. So, but how much were the people expecting? On the red Phillips curve, people were expecting inflation to be 3%, but now it has fallen to 2.5. So what will people start doing? You can clearly see that at point C, people's expectation of inflation is higher than the actual. So they will start revising their expectations of inflation down. So I can say that lower inflation at 2.5% will bring down the expected inflation as well, will bring down pi e as well from 3% level. Remember, initially expected inflation was 2%. Consumption boom and all that which happened caused expected inflation to rise to 3%. Now from 3%, it will fall back to 2.5. It will fall back to 2.5. So the Phillips curve will now shift down. So the Phillips curve will now shift down to the blue Phillips curve, or I can draw the blue Phillips curve now. It is going to drop to the blue Phillips curve. So it's going to be somewhere It's going to be somewhere here. If I draw the blue Phillips curve, it's going to be somewhere here. So the Phillips curve is also going to shift down back. So this is my Phillips curve, blue Phillips curve corresponding to the expected inflation of 2.5%. That means from the black Phillips curve, we went to the red Phillips curve, and then from red Phillips curve, we are shifting down to the blue Phillips curve, because now when the inflation falls to 2.5%, which is the yellow one, see, 2.5%, people's expectation of inflation was 3%. Now actual inflation falls to 2.5. So people will start revising their expectation of inflation down. So from the red, we shift down to the blue Phillips curve. So I can write this point that lower inflation, and now let me also erase this particular portion of, lower inflation will bring, the Phillips curve down. Lower inflation will bring the Phillips curve down to the blue Phillips curve. It will bring the Phillips curve down to the blue Phillips curve, as all students can see, where on the blue Phillips curve, the expected inflation is now 2.5, equal to the actual inflation, the yellow inflation of 2.5. Now, what point will central bank choose on the blue Phillips curve? So this was the yellow point was C. Now the central bank will choose what point? The central bank will now choose point D here. See, let me darken the blue point. This is the blue point. This is the blue point. On the new blue Phillips curve, the central bank will choose the blue point. You can see the blue point is closer to the target inflation rate of 2%, and it's also closer to the equilibrium outcome. So I can say that the central bank will choose the blue point, call it as point D. Blue point is point D as its best response to the new inflation environment. It faces. On the red Phillips curve, it was choosing the yellow point. The yellow point was point C. The yellow point, I can write point C was the yellow point. I can write it here. The yellow dark point, students can see. This is the yellow point, and this is the blue point. The blue point is point D, corresponding to the expected inflation of 2.5%. The yellow point is point C, corresponding to the expected inflation of 3%. Okay, when you join points C and D, you get the monetary rule curve. So if I join the yellow and the blue point, see, I'm joining them. This green curve is the monetary rule curve, the MR curve, monetary rule curve. This green curve is what I get by joining the yellow and the blue point. The yellow point is point C, the blue point is point D. So I can further write that the central bank will choose the blue point as its best response to the new inflation environment it faces, and will adjust the interest rate down, from its peak. It will adjust the interest rate down from its peak. How come? you could clearly see that the interest rate first of all went from B to C. This was point C. This was point C. Point C was, okay, let me correct myself slightly. Uh, my equilibrium output at point C was how much? The yellow one, right? The yellow one dragged up. If I drag up the yellow one, corresponding to yellow one, the point was C. The interest rates were very high. And now corresponding to the blue one, this is the blue one. If I stretch the blue one up, see, this is going to be Z. The blue one corresponds to Z. That means the D point, the blue point, if I stretch up to the top diagram, it's Z. And the yellow one, if I stretch up, if I stretch this yellow up from here, it was C. If I stretch the blue up from here, it's going to be Z. So the central bank is going to bring the interest rates down. So this was, if I stretch this up forward, if I stretch the axis, this was the interest rate at C, and this is the interest rate at C. So the interest rates are going to go down from their peak. The peak was happening at point C. They're going to go down from IC to IZ. Okay, so I can say that the central bank will keep on doing this till it comes back to the equilibrium output and inflation, target inflation. So if I erase the initial portion off on the top, I can continue with the explanation on the top. Erasing all this off, I can write that in the subsequent periods, the central bank will continue to guide the economy. The central bank will continue to guide the economy along the MR curve. It will continue to guide the economy along the MR curve by reducing the interest rates, as inflation returns back to its target rate. As inflation returns back to its target rate of 2%. You will see the interest rates reach their peak at point C. IC is the highest. Then the interest rates start falling along the MR curve. The green curve is the MR curve. You can clearly see that along the MR curve, you are slightly now becoming closer to the equilibrium output and coming back to the target inflation rate of 2%. Okay, so this adjustment process finishes. This adjustment process finishes when the economy is back to the point Z. Point Z exactly coincides with point A. Remember, this was point A. So let's call this as point Z also. A/Z. This red point, the adjustment process will keep on continuing till you reach back the Z point. Corresponding to Z, you have equilibrium output and you have target inflation of 2%. So this adjustment process finishes when the economy is back to point Z, which is the red point in the last diagram, which coincides with point A, with which the whole story started, which coincides with point A. Point A and Z coincide with each other. Okay, so but if you look at the initial situation compared to the initial situation at point A, at point Z, the interest rates are now high. We started everything with being at point A. Now, eventually, we reach point Z. In the last diagram, A and Z are coinciding, but in the first diagram, A and Z are not coinciding. Interest rates at point Z are more than interest rates at point B. So I can say there will be a higher interest rate. There will be a higher interest rate at the new equilibrium. There will be a higher interest rate at the new equilibrium as shown in the IS curve. That is, interest rates at point Z are more than interest rates at point. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. So you can clearly see when interest rates are higher compared to point A, it's going to cause investment to fall. So I can say, therefore, a reduced level of investment, Why will investment reduce? Because interest rates go up from IA to IZ. So a reduced level of investment is needed to offset the persistent consumption boom. The whole lecture started with a consumption boom. What we learn is that to offset this consumption boom, eventually the investment should fall. And this is pretty logical as well, because aggregate demand includes consumption and investment. So when consumption goes up, investment should fall for the aggregate demand and therefore the output to remain at the equilibrium level. If one thing is rising, the other should fall, right? For aggregate demand and for the output to remain at the equilibrium level. Okay, so I stop in this particular lecture. It was a tough lecture, okay, for me as well, because it involves making all students write notes and simultaneously explaining from the diagram as well. Now, I request all students that you should watch this lecture again. Okay, please watch this lecture 1 or 2 more times. Then it will become even more clear. And you can refer to the book as well. Okay, please refer to the book. This is page 90 of the book. If I erase all this off, okay, please refer to page number 90 of the book Macroeconomics by Wendy Carlin. I wrote the name of the book in the beginning of the lecture, but I'm writing it again. Macroeconomics by Wendy Carlin and David Soskis. Refer to page 90 of the book. This is chapter 3, the 3 equation model. You can have a read from the book as well. Okay, so in the next lecture, I'm going to continue with the 3 equation model. We're going to look at the MR curve in more depth. So we continue with the IS. We continue with the IS-PC-MR model in the next lecture. So I stop in this lecture. I hope students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubts? You can unmute your mic and ask, or you can get in touch with me for doubts on call or WhatsApp, or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this lecture.